great that all of you are here. I'm John Gross. I'm one of the volunteers. I'm going to do two things. One is I'm going to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, and then we're going to sing the Star Spangled Banner. And there's a special introduction I have for the Star Spangled Banner, so after we do the pledge, let me say a few words and then we'll do the Star Spangled Banner. But if you would all stand up, gentlemen, remove your caps. I'm going to delay just a moment here until we all get up. Looks like those who can stand are standing. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So the special introduction for the Star Spangled Banner is none of our volunteer singers are here today. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask for a volunteer singer, and I'm not a singer. So what we're going to do, we've got some piped-in music. Tom David has control of it. So we're going to play the instrumental, and I'm counting on the Evansville Wartime Museum Choir to all join in and to sing the Star Spangled Banner.
President's sidekick is vice president, so that's my job. I'm also help coordinate session and exhibits. Is what I mainly volunteer at the museum here. Just a couple things that I want to highlight going forward. If you saw in some of the little brochures, our program next 2 times here. Very important program next in 2 weeks. Dealing with supporting military with PTSD, so very important work. It's good to know about that. And then the next one would be a presentation on the Battle of the Bulge. Very interesting topic there. Just a couple of things to highlight. I think as you walk through to the hangar, you went by one of our newest exhibits, which is our vintage postcards. So if you didn't spend a little time going over that, as you leave after the program, take a little time and look at it. So it's very, very interesting. And then looking at toward the end of this month for our home front kitchen and dining room to be finished. And then we're, as you can see, working on our upcoming Holocaust exhibit. And then we've got a amazing staff working on upcoming exhibits for both the World War II area in the hangar and then our honor gallery. So be looking for new exhibits over the next 3 or 4 months there. They'll be rolling out. The one thing I want to highlight also is that we very successful education field trip programs with local schools and organizations. And that is ongoing, and we're continuing to book kids here at the museum. So it's a very important program. It's been very successful so far, so that's all going out too. If you look over there to the side, you can see a couple big pallets. That's our material for our lift. So over the next month or so, you'll be seeing that's going to go in up there on the construction. So that's some new things coming into the museum, and then once that's done, we'll start getting on our new collections room. That'll be up there in on the mezzanine. So, with that in mind, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. His name is John Lawrence. He has more than 45 years experience in archiving rare documents. You could consider him definitely an expert in archiving, specializing in medieval documents, and he's basically does programs at other significant museums and is called to help different organizations help preserve their artifacts. So his presentation is about why we do this and the value of that and why we need to continue to do that. So with no more else, here's John Lawrence.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's a little different than what I usually speak on the preservation of documents. I do believe that what is remembered lives. And I've spent 45 years in a situation. So what does the Evansville Wartime Museum have in common with all of us, basically? What is it that I have in this situation? As I said, just give me a little background so you know that I have a little bit of authority when I'm talking about. I have 45 years in rescuing a collection of ancient artifacts. I have over 300 early Christian crosses from the 2nd to the 12th century, plus 500-600 Roman, Greek, and Egyptian objects, and over 3,000 medieval and Renaissance manuscripts. What is it? Okay. Can you do this? It's okay. All right, technical. Okay, I'll try and keep the feedback from going. Why do we do what we do? I run into this all the time. We are actually the gatekeepers of history in a world that often has an attitude that we can feel in a moment of despair. Does history count? Does it modify it? Does it matter? Does anyone understand the lessons of history? I feel this often. I mean, who cares about medieval Renaissance art? Who cares about the past? And I see this situation happen. What we're dealing with here is something that is very direct, with the blood and sacrifice and personal agony that went in with the individuals that have been subject to the defense of our country. We are seeing and have experienced, all of us, and are haunted by the fact that history is not valued. It's not looked at. It's not wondered. I had a situation in my own practice, Northern Ohio, some years ago, directly related to this, a tragedy, where a young accountant that we had hired, fortunately I can blame my partner for hiring them, went to meet with a client, Paul. Paul was a very successful businessman and had won 2 silver stars in the Battle of Iwo Jima. And during the course of this discussion with this young accountant, he talked about the fact that he was planning a trip back to Iwo Jima with some of the survivors of his unit. And he was very excited about this. And he wanted to point out that he was going to pay his respects to his fallen comrades. In the course of this, he asked the accountant if he ever had the desire to visit any historic battlefields, including remote ones such as Iwo Jima. And did he ever feel any need to do that? And he said to the accountant, when I return, I'm going to bring photos and a video of what I have. This accountant, this employee, said he would be interested because he was always been wanting to see what Hawaii looked like. Now, fortunately, it's our practice to keep tight with the administrative assistants who heard this, called the office, and we ran in a pinch hitter, someone that had had quite a bit of history, who went in. Paul was very devastated. And that is the type of situation that you have going on. The Evansville Wartime Museum is a counterpoint to the ignorance, the ignoring, the disrespect that exists in our society as the value of history. Often run into this with business graduates I go to hire because I deal with a multi-ethnic group, many foreign entities, governments who have no knowledge of anything of the value of history. We see this tragically in our own situation. The Evansville War Museum itself and the collection stand as a strong tribute to the sacrifices made by multiple generations. We would all agree with that. More brave lives will be remembered with the expansion of the collection beyond the World War II area, as we see back there with Vietnam and the Korean exhibitions going on. So here's the big challenge. Does the word museum sound like mausoleum? To many people it does. That is the challenge. In reality, a museum should be a living microculture that has a beating heart with what it represents. It keeps the life, the knowledge, and the passion for the mission that it represents. And it's very key that each object alone is not important. Each object is into a fabric. It represents and presents the culture and the times that interacted with it. A collection truly gives a glimpse of the emotion of the times and tells a story. That's what we have here. Now, all museums, and I've been advisors to museums on collections, can have two faces. They can be extremely dull, or they can be extremely have passion. Museums have to tell a story. One of the issues that often happens if you go into a museum, you'll see an object, a sculpture, painting, and it will say the name, it will say the title, and you'll stand there and go, Mary's in blue, Joseph's in brown. Unless you're blind, you could see that. What is really critical to the situation is, what is the object? What does it represent? Does it have a separate existence, a separate life? These are essential questions that exist when we consider the acquisition and preservation of such objects. Oops. Okay. It's important when we view a simple object to consider what interacted with the physical culture of the times. It was connected with each object and had significance as part of that time. It's important to remember when we acquire them and go through the laborious task, and the most laborious task is the recordation and the preservation. Here is the bottom line, and I tell this to people. You cannot own an object of history. You are only its current custodian, and it must have with that the responsibility, the mantle, the sacred mantle of handing that object down to future generations. That's a very heavy weight. It's something that is borne constantly, told by officers of this museum that this is an ongoing project. Yes, it is. For hopefully for many years. It will never, never reach a finite conclusion. So what are the four elements involved in a museum? In their acquisitions, preservations, recordation, exhibitions, and research. All four of these elements are intertwined and are necessary to accomplish the mission of the museum. Including Evansville Wartime Museum. The way an exhibition is laid out has to have a flow to it, a story to it, or it loses to the passion of it. The reason for having an acquisition strategy is that an object has a finite life, and more importantly, has a finite span of availability. In the case of World War II objects, artifacts of this span, the availability is rapidly closing. The reason for that is the greatest generation is rapidly leaving us. And as they pass, the direct knowledge of the given object or artifact passes with them. It was upon my father's death that we learned that he had won 2 Bronze Stars in the Battle of the Bulge. He never talked about it. We didn't know it. We found the objects and the documentation in his papers. This is what's so important about acquiring objects from the original source. Because when they are followed by the passing to their spouses, who have an appreciation of the object or an artifact, but probably not to the extent of the original owner. In many cases, they do not know exactly what they have and are hesitant to part with the souvenirs because of their partial lack of knowledge or of sentimental value. When an object is further passed on to the next generation, and that is a big if, because with the passing of each, there is an increased probability that an object will be lost or simply disregarded. You know that whenever you've had the tragic situation of going through the belongings of another person. A truism that exists is that with each generation that an object is passed to has in general a steep decline in the knowledge and attachment to it, resulting in the likelihood of a disposal. That's why you often hear some news story of some object appearing in a thrift store, a Goodwill store somewhere. How these disposals have occurred. This is a real danger. And not that we face this daily, but in the acquisition, preservation of an object. For this reason, World War II objects and artifacts are disappearing very quickly and very soon. And unfortunately and tragically, we will not have access to them at all. The ability to obtain objects in acquisition is like a stream. It comes, and then it narrows, and then it stops. This can also be said equally of objects that are available from the Korean and Vietnam War. I have phone calls periodically from widows of Vietnam veterans who say, I have this object. In some cases, it's art objects. And they said, what do I do with it? Where should it go? I don't know what to do with it. And I've noticed something out of all acquisition projects has a finite life and has a stream of availability. So here at the Evansville Wartime Museum, we're faced with 3 challenges. We're faced with the challenge of acquisition, the fast declining ability to acquire World War II objects, followed by Korean War objects, and now we're seeing the availability of objects from the Vietnam War. Another obstacle to acquiring objects is the controversial issue of the belief that some have, many have, regarding an object or an artifact has a monetary value or worth. Often, the belief that an object has a monetary value is greatly exaggerated. This is a truism. The truth is, because an object is unique, rare, and old, does not mean it has any monetary value. I have individuals bring to me 200- and 300-year-old Bibles and say, what's this worth? Well, $50. Or someone will bring with them a object that is a Roman ceramic lamp that they obtained in North Africa. Once it's proven to be authentic, what's the object worth? $400. Just because an object's old doesn't mean it's worth anything. The belief is also worsened by individuals that inherit surgery artifacts, even though they have little or usually no knowledge of the market value. I often get calls from attorneys throughout the country saying that I have, for example, I received a phone call 2 weeks ago. We have an 8th century Byzantine cross. And I said, the individual went on, and I said, yes, I know about that cross. I was the one who wrote the description that your client has. Well, then you'd be good to tell us what it's worth. I said, what it's worth is what's stated in the document, which is under $1,000. Just because it is old doesn't mean it's valued. An object or an artifact, its value is directly related to the existence of the market, period. And we are seeing that the market for objects is very, very narrow. For example, if you talk to antique dealers, many of them are going out of business. There doesn't seem to be an interest in acquiring antiques anymore. Why is this a danger? Because if something doesn't have value, it's disregarded, it's thrown away, it's disposed of. It's something of that nature. Compounding this practice and compounding this issue is a practice of consignments, which is generally made on the hope that a consignee will have the market for the object. In other words, I'm going to consign an object with the hope that if it becomes a part of an equal display, the facility will purchase it. Consignments are important if an individual doesn't want to part with an object. Not yet. But what will happen eventually to that object is another question. So unless an object has a unique purpose and provenance, and that is a key word, a consignment should be avoided. A common internal concern, and one that is faced by museums and educational institutions, is that objects are being acquired faster than they can be preserved and recorded by the curators and archivists. This is born out of a legitimate frustration with the volume and time-consuming work that is experienced in a task to preserve and record an object. However, while these backlogs of objects are waiting their incorporation into a museum, is daunting, the availability of such objects is disappearing. And again, this is true of our World War II objects and artifacts. My opinion, based on my experience advising museums, and based in museums that have failed to follow this and regretted it later, as they told me, it's better to acquire the objects while recognizing the frustration of the archivists and curators in having such a backlog. In other words, the stream will end. Eventually, you'll get caught up. So the availability of the object is more important than the quickness by which you record it or even preserve it. Ladies and gentlemen, objects and artifacts can die a death of obscurity. They are meant to be a witness of history and tell a story. They are not to be locked away and guarded just because of what they are. I run into this area often in rare book rooms of educational institutions, where rare book archivists are two choices. One is where the rare books and objects are opened up for study by scholars and even displayed in the public. And the other one is where they have machine guns surrounding it. No one can enter, figuratively. But an object that isn't displayed, that isn't shown, dies a death of obscurity. Let's give you an example. The discovery of the wreck of the Titanic. The debris field around it was mined. Objects were taken from that debris field, very personal objects. And these were shown in Titanic exhibitions throughout the country. It was not unusual to attend one of these, to see individuals leaving the exhibition, wiping tears from their eyes. But what exhibitions, what objects do, and why they should preserve, is they promote the further study of the history surrounding that object and the events. So, that is one of the many reasons the Archival Wartime Museum, like other museums, has for the acquisition preservation of the objects. Hopefully stimulate some type of emotional response, which often stimulates then the curiosity of doing further research. Now, there are those who are fortunately in a minority who have an elitist view that such objects should not be preserved, and that history should be allowed to die a natural death. Often, they have this view based on opinions that their academic credentials are superior to any other's knowledge, and anyone that has a lack of these credentials is not allowed to engage in the science of preservation. Very elitist and very false attitude. Example of the situation is the Marconi radio inside the Titanic. There was a group that had a very serious plan to go into the wreck and to pull the Marconi radio out. And the Marconi radio, as you see it in all the movies regarding the wreck of the Titanic, broadcasting the SOS. The call for relief, the call for emergency to the end. That very radio, they know where it's at, and they wanted to pull it out. However, there was a tremendous fight, and the elitists who wanted to keep the Marconi radio within the Titanic won. The others decided to abandon it. The Titanic is expected to disappear completely within 20 years. So, what is the attitude is? What is the challenge? Do we preserve? Do we acquire something? Or do we allow it to disappear? So, there's a line of demarcation between protecting an object versus allowing the object to be used for its important mission. It's a witness of history. And the objects stimulate, as I said, the desire of individuals who view them to further study their historical background. This is the challenge that faces curators and archivists. At what point does one supplant the other? The basic preservation, the basic science of this is that all objects and all artifacts deteriorate from the time that they are created. There is nothing that we can do to stop the deterioration. Look at me, I've been deteriorating for 73 years. I feel my deterioration out. There's nothing I can do to stop it. I want to stop it, I want to try it, but it's happening. The thing that can be done, which is the objective of preservation, is to slow the deterioration to a level that is hardly noticeable. Most difficult decision for preservation. For example, what we have here is a letter from my uncle, Private First Class Albert Dipple, 1 month before he was killed, at the Battle of Hanover, Germany, home to my mother. And we have here a 16th century Middle Eastern manuscript. Would you hold that up, please? You can see how Uncle Albert's letter is in far worse shape than a manuscript that is 400 years older. So the cycle of deterioration is there. This is the letter from the War Department informing my grandfather of the death of my uncle. I should say actually from the commanding officer, circumstances. And this is a 16th century papal bull. Would you hold that up again, please? You can see that the letter from the general is in far worse shape than 400-year-old manuscript. This is the challenge the evidence of war museum faces. Because all objects, no matter what level of preservation, will go to the point that they no longer can be handled. They can no longer be studied. In my case, this is a battle axe. All right? Looks pretty good shape, doesn't it? This battle axe, which has been preserved, is 3,500 years old. It was used in an actual battle. It could go next to the exhibitions here. But you would notice that the deterioration is close. So what you have is a situation, and the most difficult decision for preservationists is to how to preserve an object. And if we display an object, thank you, if we display an object, do we accelerate its deterioration? What's the answer to that? Well, the answer to this is that any object we have here in the Evansville War Museum, any museum, was not created with the idea that it's going to have an existence about past its immediate usage, particularly when we talk about objects that were used in the defense of our country, as we see with military objects and artifacts. There's even a crisis existing today, which I kind of enjoy, I'm not a fan of it, obviously, was what was termed modern art in the middle 20th century, from about 1930 through the 1980s, were made of such materials that they are rapidly deteriorating in museums, and there's nothing the curators or the preservationists can do because of the materials they were created from. Secondly, when we look at preservation, each object has a unique challenge to its preservation, which is related to its composition, the material's subsequent usage. Third, and this is a tremendous one, the cost of preservation is directly related to the methods and environmental controls that are utilized to present such objects. We are here in Evansville in the worst form of external environment for an object, particularly paper objects. Objects hate heat and humidity, and we are ground zero. And so here in Evansville, we have a dual standard and a dual force to have to preserve such objects. Fourth, related to the third object, is having a facility large enough and thus adaptable to the specialized preservation of objects and artifacts based on its character. Well, I have to tell you, the first time I was here, and I was asked a tour to tell me what I thought of the exhibits, I was surprised. I was surprised at the extent of this facility and how the facility is being utilized and integrated. And I mean that in the truest sense of the compliment. Fifth is adequate security. Not only just when the museum is closed, but during the hours when the exhibition are open. Sixth, as I said, the environmental factors. It's always better for an object to be cold rather than hot. And this includes what you have in your home. This includes furniture. This includes artworks. So often in the summer, when we want to conserve here in Evansville, electric costs are turning the air conditioning to a much higher level. Lower, we are going to offset that with if you have any type of semi-valuable artwork with the deterioration that occurs from that. Seventh, and I think this is the most important part, and it applies here to the Evansville Museum, Wartime Museum, is the ability to recruit and retain individuals with the intellectual abilities, passion, and unlimited patience, because it takes a lot of patience, to engage in the tedious work of preserving and archiving the objects. So, do we have any of our archivists and preservationists in the Wartime Museum here? Up there? Come on, stand up, guys. Give them an applause. It's a dirty, tedious, frustrating work, but it is so, so necessary. So what are the three main categories of objects subject to preservation solutions, and they impact directly on the objects we have here as a wartime museum. Paper, as Karen showed you a moment ago, this is the most fragile of the objects. Particularly mid to late 20th century paper, which is acid base. That's why it deteriorates with its coloring. And subject to rapid deterioration to the point that eventually cannot be handled, even exposed at all. Do you realize the Library of Congress, behind the walls, there is a large collection of 19th century books that the Library of Congress has to make a terrible, terrible decision. Either to somehow and very expensively preserve these books or allow them to vanish into nothing. You can have this if some of you find in your luggage in your attic a paperback book from the 50s or 60s. You see what I mean? Paper is the most difficult. And I brought some objects, and Karen showed you those objects to do the comparison. Now, as I said, these objects and letters, the letters that were from my uncle, reported to him, are in much worse shape than centuries old times. So what's the answer to that? We can't stop a deterioration of object. So what should we do in a situation like that? We should digitize it. And as a fact person who had often been opposed to digitalization, it is necessary to preserve the contents and the image of the object, because the object itself, particularly paper ones, will not be here. Fabrics. These are less prone to deterioration than paper, but face the immediate issues of insect infestation and environmental factors here again, which we have in Evansville, requiring an atmosphere of 68 to 75 degrees, even if they're stored in acid-free boxes, which are not cheap. And as we can see, the desire to have an environment. When I walked in here today, some people said to me, "What's cold in here?" To me, I think it's comfortable because the objects are comfortable. They could speak. So maybe we need to wear a sweater and let the objects enjoy the cooler existence and better humidity. Extremes of temperature can promote the growth of mold separation material. The ideal humidity is 40 to 55%. Metal objects, even these marvelous objects, the bifold plane, the P-47, even they are deteriorating ever so gradually, maybe not so noticeable, day by day. So, what is their condition to be here? This is the best place on, because the temperature is kept at 68 to 75 degrees. All objects, be they paper, metal, or fabric, want to go back to their raw material origin through rust. And the ultimate factor in all of this is to determine the availability degree of preservation, is ability to fund it, because it is expensive and constant and necessary. Recordation. How is Evansville Wartime Museum more advanced than the British Museum and the Smithsonian? Anyone want to venture a guess on that to me? I'll tell you, and I direct this directly to the importance of our archivists up there. The British Museum is missing 4,000 to 5,000 objects and growing every day that they discovered a curator was selling on the side. And PayPal and everything. Now here's the problem, which they have to admit. We know these are our objects, but we can't prove it because we never reported it. This is the case. What aspirates this theft is there's a lack of archival records. So guess what? Those of you up there, you're doing a better job than the British Museum in your objects. Closer to home, a number of years ago, the Smithsonian had World War I and World War II objects that were being stolen out of the Smithsonian and sold on the side. That was only discovered by accident by a college professor in a remote Michigan university. And even the FBI didn't want to take interest in it. They sent a rookie agent on her first case. She found out, wait a minute, this is happening. There was a market for these objects, and this was occurring. So the word recordation is a simple term for a very expansive process that is the heart of the museum and its collections. The most important part in this process, the most fragile part, is to identify the donor, and the nature of the object. Because the provenance, the life, the meaning of an object is its direct identification of where it came from, who had it, what it meant, which is what, interesting, so much of the displays being done by the curator point out the provenance. Provenance is what gives an object its life, its meaning, its interconnection, its passion. Example would be the donation of medals. It's very important that the recordation process initially, who was awarded these medals? How were they awarded these medals? Are there any documentation? Bring to life the individual, the circumstances of those medals. This is very difficult because a lot of the World War II records were destroyed in a 3-day fire in the National Military Archives in St. Louis, about 30 years ago. And service records were destroyed as well as other ones were destroyed. So it's very important to get a contemporary view of them. So what we see is the time-consuming process of interviewing, obtaining this background, is meant by the word provenance. Provenance is the validation of the object and is most important. Central to the character of it. It adds to the historic stay and period and story and creates an interest in part of the exhibit. So our archivists, and I'm not here to throw accolades to them, but I am, because you deserve it, have great intellectual skills of toleration for conditions and whether the objects are recorded or not. Such as, have you ever seen a 500-year-old dead cockroach, what it looks like? Or how they would open boxes to find the dead insects, dirt, dust, the technical observation skills to note the condition of an object and need for preservation, and most of all, the patience and task in doing it. By doing this, they guarantee the object's place in history, that it belongs somewhere. It is part of something. It can live, because objects do have a life, as I said. They tell a story. They have with it a lot of the background that we can only imagine is happening. So, preservation, purpose of recordation, identity of the object, explanation, validation, characterization, definition of the object, and establishment, most importantly, in the existence of the collection. And it's very important because you cannot own an object, even if you buy it legitimately from someone that has been stolen. No matter how many times this is happening. This was established clearly in 1985 and really pertains to World War II objects and pre-World War II objects. And the comprehensive inventory preserves it. In many cases, we have museums that have 100-year-old catalogs or proof of where this object was. We're seeing this with the recovery of artwork in Europe by families who've identified it in a gallery, who identified it in a private collection. Wait a minute, my grandfather had it in 1932. Here is the brochure. These serve as legal documents to it. So, the vast task of recordation should focus first on the objects and artifacts. And then, even though we are building a serious library here at Denver Wartime Museum, this is a separate project. This is something that does not have the importance of the objects. And the creation of a database for the collection of books is a very large separate one. Finally, exhibitions. The combination of the process of acquisition, preservation, recordations, exhibitions. Exhibitions, as I said, are meant to tell a story, with the auxiliary benefit of that story to create a viewer desire to research further the story. This is where the work of the archivist is so valuable, and where the curator and the archivist work together. So, bottom line, should the object be stored away, or should the object be displayed? Objects die death of obscurity. The scripting of an object is the essence of an interesting exhibition. And to make a description alive, it should include as much of the provenance as possible, which I see as a credit here to them as a wartime museum. Something that should continue. So, in effect, that's what we have. And so I'm out of time. And therefore, are there any questions? Yes, sir.
State your name and stand up.
Okay, name's Norman Kohler. Question is, what's going to happen to your items when you pass on?
My art?
Yeah.
That's a very big question, sir. That's what, no, that is, and Karen can tell you that. My collection is so large that the Cleveland Museum of Art cannot take it. And the big question with exhibitions and collections, such as I have, is something that's called non-deascension. Now, deascension is the unsavory process. There's a big lawsuit against Valparaiso University, where the president of the university decided to sell 20 of the more valuable artworks to build dormitories. The people that donated that artwork did not give that to an institution to be sold off. So you have to have built into an agreement with any donee a deascension. And that's a big question. And as I get older, it gets to be a bigger question. Now, last thing you want to do, and this includes objects, whether it's Korean, Vietnam, and Vietnam to the Vietnam veterans, particularly, is leave them to be handled by your survivors. It creates an emotional burden. It's better, if you can, to let things go as time goes on. Other questions?
I have one. Can you give either one or maybe two examples over your career? What were a couple of the most exciting things that you found on the provenance of it? Can you give a couple examples of what keeps you driving doing this?
An individual brought to me from the Evansville area a book one day. And this was 20-some years ago when I was doing an exhibition in New Harmony. And so, Mr. Lawrence, will you take a look? So these turn into the Antiques Roadshows. And no, that's not anything. This book was written, and it was notated by Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci's notations of marginalia, his drawings in the back. We have young Da Vinci, old Da Vinci, middle Da Vinci writings that were never published. The individual had obtained the book from his wife's uncle. He was elderly. Further research in this book indicated that it was in the inventory of Da Vinci's books, but was missing when all the books were going to the Royal British Library. That was one. Second one, when I was called into the College of Worcester Rare Book Room, and they are very liberal art schools, very wealthy, and asked to look, and what I found were two 15th century Bibles they didn't know they had. And then there were 4 witchcraft documents from the 15th century. There's only one in existence, it's in the British Museum, with a notation. They were in a paper bag still. From 1940, never sell these to Harvard, because they refused to give me $100 for them. And there are other objects. Mostly they're objects that individuals have. And I will mention that I'm having widows of Vietnam veterans call me and say, Mr. Lawrence, I have some artwork, would you look at it? And what these often are jade statuettes, or statues that were taken from temples or shrines during the conflict in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Now, as artwork goes, they are inferior, according to the art experts, to Chinese art. But they're still artwork. And they still belong to those countries because under the 1985 Paris Accords, you can't have good title to them. Over 1 million books were destroyed during the bombing in World War II Germany. We know of objects that are appearing daily. One of the great objects missing that I had talked to one of the individuals whose life was the amber room, which was an entire room made of amber, that we know that the Nazis took apart. What happened to it, we don't know. Anyone else have any questions? Well, I'm available here if you have anything, and available to talk to you, and I thank you for coming out today. Appreciate it.
We have two couples purchased memberships today, and if you could stop by the gift shop, there's some material that goes with that, and we'd like to see that you get it. And thank you all for coming, and see you in 2 weeks.